a prophet whose words could bend the fate of nations, a king trembling on his throne, desperate to stop a people no army could defeat. And in the middle of it all, a donkey. Yes, a donkey who saw more of heaven than the prophet riding on her back. This is one of the strangest and most unsettling stories in all of Scripture, where God turns the world upside down to expose ambition, pride, and the unshakable power of his blessing. A man renowned for spiritual vision will be struck blind to the very angel standing before him. A humble animal created for burden-bearing will speak wisdom sharper than the prophet's tongue. If you want to witness this incredible spiritual confrontation, make sure you hit the like button now. And if you have not already, subscribe and turn on notifications so you do not miss this tale of a humble animal who spoke wisdom sharper than a prophet's tongue. Let us begin. The wind howling over the plains of Moab did not carry the scent of rain. It carried the scent of fear. Balak, the son of Zippor and king of Moab, stood alone on the highest balcony of his palace. His hands gripped the cold stone railing until his knuckles turned white. He was a man accustomed to power. He was used to the weight of a sword in his hand and the comforting solidity of a crown upon his head. Yet as he looked out toward the horizon, he felt a sensation that no king ever wishes to admit. He felt small. Below him, the sun was beginning to dip below the western hills, casting long, bruised shadows across the valley. But it was not the sunset that stole the breath from his lungs. It was what lay beneath it, stretching across the desert floor, filling the valley of the Jordan River, like a sudden overwhelming flood, were tents. They were not merely hundreds. They were not merely thousands. They were countless. They spread out like the dust of the earth, a living sea of canvas and firelight that seemed to possess no beginning and no end. This was Israel. Balak closed his eyes for a moment, trying to shut out the sight, but the image was burned into his mind. Reports had been reaching his throne room for weeks, carried by breathless scouts and terrified merchants. They spoke of a people who had emerged from the iron furnace of Egypt, not as refugees, but as a conquering storm. They spoke of a God who marched before them in pillars of cloud and fire. The king opened his eyes and looked again. He could see the faint smoke rising from their evening fires. He could hear the low, distant hum of a nation preparing for rest. It sounded like the growl of a sleeping lion. "There are too many," Balak whispered to the wind. His voice trembled, a sound he despised in himself. "They cover the face of the earth." He turned away from the railing and began to pace the length of the balcony. His mind raced through the history of the last few months. He thought of Sihon, the king of the Amorites. Sihon had been strong. His walls were thick and his warriors were fierce. Yet when he stood against this people, his kingdom had shattered like a clay pot dropped on stone. He thought of Og, the giant king of Bashan. Og was a legend, a man whose physical power was the subject of songs. He too had fallen. His territory was now possessed by these wanderers. Moab was next. Balak knew the strength of his own army. He knew how many spears he could muster and how many chariots sat in his stables. Against any other neighbor, against the Midianites or the Edomites, he would have felt confident. But this was different. This was not a war of strategy or steel. This was a force of nature. He stopped pacing and looked back at the camp. The first stars were appearing in the sky, mirroring the thousands of campfires below. It felt as though the heavens and the earth were conspiring to surround him. "They will lick up everything around us," Balak said, his voice gaining a sharp edge of panic. "Just as an ox licks up the grass of the field." The metaphor tasted bitter in his mouth. He saw his kingdom, his legacy, and his people as nothing more than grass waiting to be consumed. The fear was physical now. It sat heavy in his stomach. He realized that if he met them on the field of battle with swords and shields, Moab would cease to exist. The God of Israel did not seem to play by the rules of men. He needed a solution that steel could not provide. Balak turned his back on the valley. He walked swiftly into his chambers, his robes sweeping across the stone floor. He called for his servants, his voice sharp and commanding, masking the terror that gripped his heart. Summon the elders, he ordered. Summon the elders of Midian as well. Tell them the wolf is at the door and we must decide how to keep it from devouring us. As the servants scrambled to obey, Balak moved to a table where a map of the region lay unrolled. He stared at the borders of his land. They looked so fragile now, mere lines of ink against a tide of history that threatened to wash them away. He needed power. Not the power of muscles or iron, but power from the unseen realm. He needed to strike them before they even lifted a spear. He needed to break their spirit before they could break his walls. A name rose in his mind. It was a name whispered in the courts of kings from the Euphrates to the Great Sea. It was a name that carried a heavy price, but also a terrifying promise. Balaam. Balak traced the path on the map with his finger all the way to the distant river where the prophet dwelt. It was a long journey. It would cost him a fortune in gold and silver. But what was gold compared to survival? If I cannot defeat them with the sword, Balak vowed in the silence of his room, then I will defeat them with a word. He looked once more toward the balcony where the glow of the Israelite camp illuminated the night sky like a second dawn. The fear was still there, cold and biting. But now it was joined by a desperate resolve. He would not go down quietly. He would unleash a power that even this God of Israel might not be able to withstand. Or so he hoped. The council chamber was thick with the smoke of oil lamps and the heavier, suffocating atmosphere of anxiety. The elders of Moab and the elders of Midian sat in a tight circle, their faces grave. These were men who had governed tribes, negotiated treaties, and survived droughts. They were not easily shaken. Yet tonight the silence in the room was loud. King Balak stood at the head of the room. He had composed himself. The trembling he had felt on the balcony was gone, replaced by the rigid, brittle strength of a man with only one option left. He looked at the faces before him. He saw the same fear he felt reflected in their eyes. "You have seen them, Balak," began his voice low and resonant. "You have seen the multitude that covers the plains of Jericho. They are not merely an army. They are a plague." One of the elders of Midian, a man with a beard as white as salt, nodded slowly. "We have heard the reports, great king. The Amorites are gone. Bashan is fallen. This people, they do not just conquer, they consume." "Precisely," Balak said, stepping into the center of the circle. "They are like the ox that licks up the grass. Nothing is left behind. If we wait for them to come to us, we are already defeated." A murmur of agreement went through the room. A younger chieftain from Moab spoke up, his hand resting nervously on the hilt of his dagger. "Then we must strike first. We must gather every spear, every archer, and ambush them while they rest." Balak shook his head violently. "You speak like a fool. Did Sihon not have spears? Did Og not have strength? This people cannot be fought with weapons of war. Their God fights for them. To attack them with swords is to attack a thunderstorm with a stick. Then what are we to do? Do we sit here and wait for our end?" "No," Balak said. His eyes gleamed in the flickering light. "We fight them on a battlefield they cannot see. We strike at the source of their strength." He paused, letting the tension build. He wanted them to understand the gravity of his plan. "We need a curse," Balak declared. The word hung in the air, heavy and dark. In the ancient world, a curse was not a mere insult. It was a weapon. It was a binding force that could cripple an army, wither a harvest, or turn the favor of the gods against a nation. "There is a man," Balak continued, watching their reactions carefully. "He lives in Pethor near the great river Euphrates. His name is Balaam, the son of Beor." Recognition flashed across the faces of the elders. They began to whisper among themselves. Balaam, the Midianite elder, said, his voice hushed with awe, "I have heard of him. They say his words do not fall to the ground empty. They say more than that," Balak corrected him. "They say that the one he blesses is blessed and the one he curses is cursed. His voice shapes destiny. If he speaks against this people, their strength will wither. Their God will turn from them. And then, only then, can we drive them out? But Pethor, as far another man, objected. And Balaam is a great man. Why would he come to aid Moab? Balak walked back to his throne and picked up a heavy wooden chest that sat beside it. With a grunt of effort, he heaved it onto the central table. He threw back the lid. The light of the lamps caught the shimmer of silver and the deep glow of gold. Rings, chains, heavy bars of precious metal and jewels that sparkled like captured stars. The elders stared, their breath catching in their throats. This, Balak said, gesturing to the treasure, is the wages of divination. No prophet, no matter how holy, is immune to the allure of security and honor. We will buy his voice. He looked at the assembly, his expression hard. I need messengers. I need men of noble birth, princes of Moab and elders of Midian. You must ride to Pethor. You must lay this gold at his feet. You must tell him that Balak, king of Moab, begs for his aid. He leaned forward, his hands resting on the edge of the table, his eyes boring into theirs. Tell him this, Balak commanded. Behold, a people has come out of Egypt. They cover the face of the earth, and they are settling opposite me. Come now, curse this people for me, for they are too mighty for me. Perhaps I shall be able to defeat them and drive them from the land. The plan was set. It was a desperate gamble, a bid to purchase a miracle. Balak believed that spiritual power was a commodity, something that could be traded and bought like grain or cattle. He did not know the God of Israel. He did not know that the Creator of heaven and earth could not be bribed with silver. But the elders did not know this either. They saw only hope. They saw a way to survive the coming storm. We will go, the elder of Midian said, standing up. We will ride with the wind. We will bring Balaam to you, or we will not return. Balak nodded. Go. Take the fees for divination in your hand. Do not stop. Do not rest. Bring me the man whose words can save us. As the council dispersed, moving quickly to prepare for the long journey north, Balak remained in the chamber. He stared at the empty chest where the gold had been. He had emptied a significant portion of his treasury for this. He walked to the window, looking north, the direction the messengers would ride. He imagined Balaam, this mysterious seer, sitting in his house by the river. He imagined the man opening his mouth and speaking words of doom over the tents of Israel. Balak allowed himself a grim smile. He felt a fleeting sense of control returning. He was a king, and kings took action. He had identified the threat, and he had dispatched the weapon to neutralize it. Curse them, Balak whispered into the darkness. Curse them and let them fade away. Outside, the wind continued to howl, whipping around the stone towers of the palace. Far below, in the valley of the Jordan, the camp of Israel remained peaceful and undisturbed, unaware of the riders who were saddling their horses, unaware of the gold that was being counted, and unaware of the king who sought to buy their destruction. The messengers mounted their steeds. The gates of the city creaked open. With the sound of hooves thundering against the hard earth, the embassy of Moab rode out into the night, carrying with them the price of a curse, beginning a journey that would lead to an encounter none of them could possibly foresee. The journey from the high plains of Moab to the banks of the great river Euphrates was not merely a distance of miles. It was a journey from fear into hope. The caravan of messengers rode out under the cover of darkness. They were the princes of Moab and the elders of Midian, men accustomed to soft robes and cool stone floors. Now they were wrapped in travel cloaks, their faces set against the biting wind of the desert. They did not carry weapons of war, for their mission was not to fight. Instead, they carried chests of heavy wood bound with iron. Inside these chests lay the wealth of a kingdom. There were ingots of silver, rings of gold, and precious stones that had been mined from the deep places of the earth. This was the price of a curse. For days they rode north. The landscape shifted around them. They left behind the dry, salt-laden air of their homeland and entered the rugged valleys that led toward the great river. The heat of the day was relentless. The sun beat down upon them like a hammer, reminding them of the urgency of their task. Every time they stopped to water their horses, the conversation turned to the same subject: Israel. One of the elders of Midian, a man named Zur, wiped the sweat from his brow and looked back toward the south. "Do you think they will move while we are gone?" he asked, his voice rough with dust. "Do you think they will attack before we return with the prophet?" A prince of Moab shook his head. "They seem content to wait. They are like a storm cloud that hovers, but does not yet break. That is why we must ride faster. We must bring the lightning before the storm descends." They pressed on. They crossed rushing streams and navigated narrow mountain passes. The physical burden of the journey was great, but the mental burden was heavier. They carried the survival of their people in their saddlebags. If Balaam refused them, if this prophet could not be bought, then they would return to a doomed land. As they neared the Euphrates, the world became greener. Trees lined the waterways, and the air grew thick with the scent of water and life. It was a stark contrast to the arid fear they had left behind. They were entering the land of the East, a place known for ancient wisdom and dark mysteries. Finally, after weeks of riding, the city of Pethor appeared on the horizon. It sat by the river, a place of trade and influence. The messengers straightened their robes and brushed the dust from their beards. They were ambassadors of a king, and they needed to look the part. They checked the chests of gold once more to ensure the treasure was secure. They rode through the gates of Pethor, not as conquerors, but as beggars disguised in royalty. They were there to purchase a weapon that no smith could forge. They were there to buy a few words from the mouth of a man who claimed to hear the voice of the Almighty. Balaam, the son of Beor, sat in the courtyard of his home. It was a residence that spoke of success. The walls were high and thick, offering privacy from the bustling streets of Pethor. The garden was lush, watered by channels cut from the river. He was a man who had turned spiritual insight into a comfortable life. He was not unaware of his reputation. He knew that in the courts of Egypt and the palaces of the East, his name was whispered with a mixture of reverence and fear. Balaam, they said. The man whose eyes are open. He enjoyed the title. He enjoyed the way men bowed to him, hoping to catch a fragment of favor. A servant entered the courtyard, bowing low. "Master," the servant said, "men have arrived from the south. They're nobles. They ride horses of fine breeding, and they carry chests that appear heavy." Balaam did not stand immediately. He took a slow sip of wine from a silver cup. He knew the value of patience. "Let them wait," he said softly. Anticipation sharpens the appetite. When he finally entered the main hall, the visitors were waiting. The dust of the road still clung to their garments, but the richness of their attire was unmistakable. These were not common travelers. The leader of the delegation, a prince of Moab, stepped forward and bowed. The others followed suit. "Greetings, great seer," the prince said. "We come from Balak, son of Zippor, king of Moab." Balaam nodded, his face a mask of calm. "Moab is far. What brings such distinguished guests to my humble home?" The prince did not waste words. He motioned to the servants who'd accompanied them. They brought forward the chests and opened them. The lamplight danced across the piles of silver and gold. It was a fortune. It was enough to build a palace. It was enough to ensure that a man would never want for anything for the rest of his days. Balaam's eyes flickered toward the treasure, then back to the prince. He felt a quickening in his chest. This was the greatest offer he had ever received. "The king of Moab sends this," the prince said, his voice urgent. "And he sends a message. A people has come out of Egypt. They cover the face of the land, and they have settled next to me." The prince took a step closer. "Come now, curse them for me, for they are too mighty. Perhaps then we may defeat them and drive them out." Balaam listened. He knew of this people. The rumors of their God, the one who split the sea, the one who humbled Pharaoh, had reached even Pethor. This was not a small request. They were asking him to stand against a power that had already toppled empires. But the gold shimmered in the corner of his vision. It whispered promises of power and luxury. "Our king will reward you richly," the prince added, seeing the hesitation in the prophet's eyes. Great honor will be yours." Balaam smoothed his beard. He knew he could not simply agree. He was a prophet, after all. He had to maintain the appearance of one who consults the divine. He could not look like a mercenary, even if his heart was already calculating the wealth. "Lodge here tonight," Balaam said, his voice measured and pious. "I will speak with the Lord and bring you back word as he may speak to me." He gestured for his servants to show the guests to their rooms. As the men left, Balaam remained in the hall. He walked over to the open chest. He reached out and touched a cold, heavy bar of silver. He wanted to go. He wanted the honor. But he knew that the God of heaven was not a deity to be trifled with. He would ask, but he feared he already knew the answer. That night the house of Balaam was silent, but the mind of the prophet was a storm. He retired to his inner chamber, a place where he claimed to meet with the Almighty. He lit no lamps. He sat in the darkness waiting. He wanted the permission of God. He wanted the Lord to look at the gold of Moab and say, "Go take it. It is yours." He reasoned with himself. Surely cursing a wandering tribe was not such a great sin. Surely God would want his prophet to be honored by kings. Then the presence came. It was not a wind or a fire. It was a weight that pressed against the very air of the room. It was the undeniable, terrifying nearness of the Creator. The voice of God spoke to Balaam. It was a question, though the all-knowing needed no information. "Who are these men with you?" Balaam swallowed hard. He felt transparent, as if his very soul were made of glass. "Balak, the son of Zippor, king of Moab, has sent to me, saying, 'Look, a people has come out of Egypt, and they cover the face of the earth. Come now, curse them for me. Perhaps I shall be able to overpower them and drive them out.'" He waited. The silence stretched tense and heavy. Then came the decree. It was sharp, clear, and allowed for no negotiation. "You shall not go with them," God said. Balaam's heart sank. "You shall not curse the people, for they are blessed." The words were final. They are blessed. It was a statement of fact as solid as the mountains. No magic, no words, no ritual could overturn a blessing that God himself had established. To fight against it was to fight against the foundation of the world. The presence lifted, leaving Balaam alone in the dark. He sat there for a long time. The answer was no. But as the morning sun began to creep through the window, a different kind of darkness took hold of Balaam's heart. He thought of the princes waiting in the guest quarters. He thought of the king waiting in Moab. He thought of the treasure he would have to refuse. He rose and went to meet the messengers. They stood up eagerly as he entered, hope shining in their eyes. "What does the Lord say?" the prince of Moab asked. Balaam looked at them. He could have told them the whole truth. He could have said, "God has blessed this people and no one can curse them. You should make peace with them." That would have been the truth of a faithful prophet. Instead, Balaam chose words that were technically true but spiritually deceptive. He protected his own reputation rather than declaring God's glory. "Go back to your land, Balaam," said his voice tinged with regret. "For the Lord has refused to give me permission to go with you." He did not say Israel is blessed. He did not say God is their shield. He only said God won't let me. He made it sound like a bureaucratic rule, a restriction that annoyed him as much as it annoyed them. He left the door of hope slightly open, implying that he wanted to go but was being held back. The princes' faces fell. The hope drained from the room. They looked at the closed chests of gold, then at the prophet who stood with his arms crossed. "He refuses," the prince asked. "He refuses," Balaam confirmed. Slowly the delegation gathered their things. The heavy chests were loaded back onto the horses. The journey home would be somber. They had failed. They rode out of the gate of Pethor, leaving Balaam standing in the shadow of his own greed, watching the dust settle on the road where his fortune had just walked away. The return journey was faster, driven by the fear of delivering bad news. When the messengers finally reached the palace of Moab, King Balak was waiting. He listened to their report in silence. He paced back and forth as the chief prince explained the refusal. "He would not come," the prince said, bowing low. "He said the Lord refused to give him permission." Balak stopped pacing. He stared at the prince, then he laughed. It was a cold, humorless sound. "Refused permission," Balak sneered. "He is a man." They only negotiate. Balak did not see this as a spiritual rejection. He saw it as a business tactic. In his mind, Balaam was holding out for a better offer. The prophet had seen the silver and gold, and he had decided it was not enough for a task of such magnitude. "He thinks he can leverage his God to extract more from me," Balak muttered to himself. "Very well. He wants to play the game of kings we will play." Balak turned to his scribe. "List for me the most honorable princes in the kingdom. Men of higher rank than these. Men whose names command respect." He looked at the weary messengers who had just returned. "You are not enough," he said cruelly. He looked at you and saw only messengers. "I will send him dignitaries. I will send him the pillars of Moab." The king's obsession was growing. The sight of the Israelite camp below his palace gnawed at his sanity. He could not accept no. He believed that every spiritual door had a key, and that key was always forged of gold. "Prepare a new delegation," Balak ordered. "More men, more servants, and tell them to promise him everything." He walked to the window and looked north. "I will not offer him a chest of gold this time," Balak whispered. "I will offer him a blank page. Whatever he asks, I will give. Whatever honor he craves, I will bestow." The king's desperation blinded him to the truth. He was trying to bribe the mouthpiece of the Almighty. He was treating the creator of the universe like a local idol that could be swayed by gifts. "Go to him." Balak commanded the new group of princes who were now assembling in the courtyard. They were dressed in purple and fine linen, the highest nobility of the land. "Tell them, let nothing, I pray you, hinder you from coming to me. For I will promote you to very great honor, and I will do whatever you say to me." "Come curse this people for me," the second delegation rode out. They were a glittering procession, a parade of wealth and desperation moving toward the Euphrates. Balak watched them go. He gripped the windowsill. He would have his curse. He would have his victory. He did not care what the Lord had said. He was a king, and he would have his way. Little did he know he was inviting a power into his land that would not be controlled, a power that would turn his own schemes against him. The stage was set for a confrontation that would shatter the pride of both the prophet and the king. The dust raised by the horses of the second delegation could be seen long before they reached the gates of Pathor. These were not merely messengers. These were the princes of the realm, the highest nobles of Moab. Their robes were dyed in deep purple and scarlet, and the trappings of their horses gleamed with polished bronze. They rode with the arrogance of men who had never been refused. Balaam stood at the entrance of his courtyard, watching them approach. He felt a heavy thudding in his chest. He had sent the first group away, but his heart had gone with them. Now, seeing this greater company, he knew that the test had returned harder and more dazzling than before. The leader of the princes dismounted. He was a man of sharp features and commanding presence. He did not bow as low as the previous messengers. He looked Balaam in the eye, knowing exactly what the prophet desired. Balaam, son of Beor, the prince, began, his voice smooth like oil. "King Balak, the son of Zippor, has sent us with a message that is not a request, but a plea from a brother." The prince stepped closer, ensuring that the other nobles and the servants of Balaam could hear. "Let nothing, I pray you, hinder you from coming to me." The prince recited the king's words. "For I will promote you to very great honor, and I will do whatever you say to me. Come curse this people for me." Balaam looked at the caravan behind the princes. The chests they carried were larger. The servants were more numerous. The promise was no longer just gold. It was power. Balak was offering him a place at the right hand of the throne. He was offering him a legacy that would outlast his lifetime. The temptation was not just greed, it was significance. Balaam wanted to be the man who saved a kingdom. He wanted to be the voice that shaped history. However, the memory of the divine prohibition was still fresh in his mind. "You shall not curse them, for they are blessed." The words of God were a wall he could not easily breach. Balaam straightened his back, wrapping his cloak tighter around himself. He needed to sound righteous. He needed to sound like a man who could not be bought even as his soul calculated the cost. "Even if Balak gave me his house full of silver and gold, Balaam," declared his voice ringing out for all to hear, "I could not go beyond the word of the Lord my God to do less or more." It was a perfect answer. It was the answer of a saint. But then the crack in his armor appeared. If he truly believed his own words, he would have sent them away immediately. He would have told them that God does not change like a man. Instead, he hesitated. "Now therefore, please," Balaam added, his voice lowering, losing its edge of conviction. "Stay here tonight also, that I may know what more the Lord will say to me." The invitation hung in the air. What more did he expect God to change his nature? Did he think the creator of the universe would be swayed by the higher rank of the messengers? The princes smiled. They understood the language of negotiation. They saw that the door was not locked, only closed. They ordered their servants to unload the camels. They would stay. They would wait. And Balaam, the man who claimed to see the visions of the Almighty, retreated into his house, hoping against hope that God would compromise. The night was suffocating. Balaam paced the floor of his inner chamber. Outside, the princes of Moab were feasting, their laughter drifting through the heavy curtains. Inside, the prophet was wrestling with silence. He knelt on the stone floor, but his prayers were not acts of submission. They were acts of bargaining. He wanted permission. He wanted the constraints of heaven to loosen just enough for him to slip through. "Lord," he whispered into the darkness, "they are great men." The king pleads. "Is there no way?" God answered. But this time the answer was terrifying in its subtlety. God did not shout. He did not forbid. He gave the prophet exactly what his divided heart demanded. "If the men have come to call you," the voice of the Lord said, "cool and distant, rise and go with them. But only the word that I speak to you, that shall you do." Balaam gasped. He heard the word "go." His heart leaped. He interpreted this as a victory. He believed that his persistence had paid off, that he had convinced the Almighty to reconsider. He missed the warning attached to the command. He missed the fact that God sometimes grants our requests to expose the corruption in our hearts. It was a permission born of judgment, not favor. The morning sun had barely touched the horizon when Balaam rose. He did not wait for the princes to call him. He did not wait for the servants to prepare his mount. Driven by an energy that was almost manic, Balaam went to the stable himself. His donkey was there, chewing quietly on straw. She was a faithful beast, having carried him for many years. She had never given him trouble. Balaam threw the saddle over her back and cinched the straps tight with his own hands. His movements were hurried and jerky. The princes of Moab were surprised to see the great prophet ready so early. They saw his eagerness and took it as a good omen. "The Lord has spoken," Balaam announced, his eyes bright with false confidence. "I will go with you." A cheer went up from the delegation. They mounted their horses. The caravan began to move, turning south toward the distant hills of Moab. Balaam rode in the center of the procession, surrounded by nobility. He sat tall on his donkey, imagining the reception he would receive from King Balak. He felt triumphant. He felt powerful. He was completely unaware that the anger of the Lord was kindled against him, not because he went, but because he went with a greedy heart, eager to sell a curse he had no right to give. He was riding toward a collision that would strip him of his dignity and force him to see the world through eyes other than his own. The road south was wide and open, cutting through fields of barley and wheat. The sun was high, casting short, sharp shadows on the ground. The mood of the company was light. The princes joked and discussed the defeat of Israel as if it were already accomplished. Balaam listened, nodding sagely, already composing the curse in his mind. But the spiritual realm was not at peace. Ahead of them, invisible to the princes and invisible to the prophet, a figure stepped onto the road. It was the angel of the Lord. He stood as an adversary. In his hand was a drawn sword gleaming with a light that was not of this world. It was an instrument of judgment, a barrier that no man could cross. Balaam saw nothing but the dusty road. He urged his donkey forward, his mind filled with visions of gold. Suddenly the donkey stiffened, her ears pinned back. She saw the terrifying warrior standing directly in her path. The sword was raised, ready to strike the rider. Panic flooded the animal. She could not go forward. With a sharp lurch, the donkey swerved off the road. She bolted into a plowed field, trampling the young crops. Balaam nearly lost his seat. He gripped the reins, his face flushing with embarrassment. The princes of Moab halted their horses, looking back in confusion. "What is the matter with the beast?" one of the nobles called out. Balaam felt the sting of humiliation. He was the great seer, the man of dignity, and here he was being carried into a field like a novice rider on a stubborn mule. "Get back," Balaam shouted, pulling hard on the bridle. "Get back to the road," the donkey refused. She stood trembling in the soft earth, her eyes fixed on the terrifying figure that only she could see. The angel had moved to block the path, silent and deadly. Balaam could not see the angel. He only saw a disobedient animal. His anger flared. He raised his staff and struck the donkey to urge her back to the path. "Move!" he screamed. The donkey flinched under the blow. She turned her head, looking at her master with wide, fearful eyes. She was saving his life, and he was punishing her for it. It was a tragic picture of spiritual blindness. The man who claimed to know the mind of God could not even see the danger standing 5 paces in front of him. With great effort, Balaam forced the animal back onto the road. He smoothed his robes, muttering apologies to the princes. He attributed the incident to the skittishness of the animal. He did not ask why. He did not pause to consider if there was a sign. He simply kicked the donkey forward, resuming his march toward his own destruction. The terrain began to change. The open fields gave way to terraced hillsides where vineyards grew in abundance. The road became a narrow path winding between high walls made of rough stacked stones. These walls were designed to protect the grapes, but now they formed a chute, a trap from which there was no easy escape. The procession had to move in single file. Balaam was ahead of the princes now, the path too tight for 2 to ride abreast. The air was still and hot between the stone barriers. Then the adversary moved. The angel of the Lord appeared again. This time, he stood in a section of the path where the walls were close together. There was no open field to run into. There was no space to turn around. The way was completely blocked by the divine sentinel in his drawn sword. The donkey saw him. Her terror returned sharper than before. She saw the blade and she knew she could not pass. But she could not turn back either. In a desperate attempt to avoid the angel, the donkey pressed herself hard against the wall on the right side. She tried to squeeze past the terrifying figure, scraping her body against the jagged stones. Balaam's foot was caught between the animal's rib cage and the wall. The stone pressed painfully against his foot. The pain was sudden and excruciating. Balaam cried out a sound of shock and agony. He looked down and saw his foot crush the leather of his sandal, tearing against the rock. The pain blinded him to reason. He did not look ahead to see why the animal shied. He did not wonder what force could make a loyal beast act so erratically. He only felt the throbbing in his foot and the rising heat of his fury. "You wretched creature," Balaam roared. He lifted his staff again. This time the blow was not just corrective, it was punitive. He struck the donkey again in his frustration. The princes behind him stopped their horses, restless in the confined space. They could not see past Balaam. They only saw the prophet shouting and beating his animal in a narrow corridor of stone. "Is he mad, a prince?" whispered to another. Why does he fight his own mount? Balaam was panting, his face red with exertion and pain. He forced the donkey to straighten up. She stood shivering, her side injured from scraping against the wall, her master's blows stinging her back. Yet she had succeeded. She had stopped him from riding into the reach of the sword. She had taken the pain to save the prophet. But Balaam was too consumed by his own ego to see it. He adjusted his foot in the stirrup, wincing at the pain. He glared at the back of the donkey's head. He was determined to force his will upon the situation. He would go to Moab. He would get his reward. He would not let a stupid animal delay his glory. He dug his heels into her sides, demanding that she move forward. He was pushing her toward the narrowest part of the pass, the place where the angel waited for the final confrontation. Balaam, consumed by the burning pain in his foot and the fury of his humiliation, spurred his donkey onward. He was deaf to the silent warnings and blind to the spiritual reality. The road, which was already narrow, finally funneled into its most restrictive point, a space where the stone walls pressed in so tightly that only a single creature could pass. The angel of the Lord stood there for the third time. He was immovable, a towering figure of light and judgment. His sword, a flash of severe certainty, was lifted, poised to strike. There was no field to turn into, no wall to press against. There was only the inevitable presence of the divine barrier. The donkey saw the angel. She saw the sword. She understood the finality of the opposition. Unable to advance and unwilling to allow her master to ride into the angel's path, the faithful animal did the only thing left to her. She collapsed. She sank to the ground beneath the prophet, crushing his other leg in the process. To Balaam, this was the final unforgivable act of defiance. 3 times his journey had been halted. 3 times he had been made to look foolish before the powerful princes of Moab. He did not see the grace in the animal's sacrifice. He only saw his ruined dignity and the shattering of his lucrative ambition. Balaam, overwhelmed by anger, struck the creature a 3rd time. The sound was sharp in the silent air. He was a man of supposed vision, yet he was striking the very mercy that stood between him and certain doom. He was unaware that this animal, created for burden-bearing, possessed more spiritual sight than the prophet who rode upon her back. He stood over the donkey, panting. His mind was so overwhelmed by anger and ambition that it had eclipsed his prophetic sight entirely. The princes of Moab watched the scene, confused and uneasy. Their prophet was fighting a battle against his own mount, a battle that seemed both ridiculous and deeply unsettling. Then the extraordinary happened. In the sudden silence that followed the prophet's 3rd blow, the Lord intervened with a miracle. God opened the mouth of the donkey. The sound was not a bray, but a clear, rational voice that cut through the silence of the narrow pass. What have I done to you that you have struck me these 3 times? Balaam was so consumed by his fury that the shock of a talking animal did not even register immediately. His anger was a veil over his senses. He spoke back to the beast as if arguing with a stubborn servant. Because you have made a fool of me, Balaam raged. If I had a weapon, I would have ended this delay immediately. The donkey, bruised and kneeling, spoke again with a quiet, devastating logic. Am I not your donkey, the one you have ridden all your life until this day? She asked. Have I ever acted this way toward you before? Balaam, confronted by the unassailable truth spoken by the creature beneath him, could only mutter one humbling word. No, the argument was over. The creature had made its case. Its perfect loyalty over a lifetime stood as a silent witness against the prophet's sudden, uncharacteristic violence. The time for the direct intervention had arrived. The moment had come for the proud man to see the terrifying truth. At that very moment, God removed the veil from Balaam's eyes. The full horror of the situation crashed down upon him. There, standing before him, sword drawn and gleaming with the terrifying light of judgment, was the angel of the Lord. The warrior filled the narrow passage, his presence heavy and severe. Fear, cold and absolute, replaced the rage in Balaam's heart. He collapsed fully to the ground and fell on his face. He was humbled not by the speaking animal, but by the angel who was prepared to bring his existence to an end. The angel spoke, his voice carrying the authority of heaven. "Why have you struck your donkey these 3 times?" He revealed the truth. "Behold, I have come out to oppose you because your way is perverse before me." The irony was crushing and undeniable. The prophet, renowned for spiritual vision, had been spiritually blind, chasing wealth and ignoring God's initial clear command. The humble animal he despised had possessed the pure sight to see the divine warrior and had taken 3 blows to her body to save her master's life. If she had not turned aside, the angel surely would have ended Balaam's life and spared the faithful beast. Shaken to his core, Balaam finally confessed. "I have sinned," he whispered into the dust. "I did not know you stood in the road to oppose me. If it displeases you, I will turn back." The angel lowered his sword, but the warning was stern. "Go with the men," he commanded, allowing the journey to continue. "But speak only the word that I tell you." Balaam rose a completely different man. His spirit was broken, his ambition exposed. The journey continued, but it was no longer a triumphant ride to honor. It was a solemn procession of a man walking under the closest divine supervision. The donkey, the angel, and the sword all testified to one profound and unbreakable truth: obedience is measured by the heart surrendered completely to God. The remainder of the journey was silent. Balaam rode his donkey, now treating her with a strange, watchful respect. He arrived at the plains of Moab not as the confident seer of Pethor, but as a humbled man who had glimpsed his own imminent destruction. King Balak, restless with anxiety, had ridden out to the border to meet them. He was impatient and eager, wanting his curse delivered immediately. He saw the solemn procession, noted Balaam's weary demeanor, and interpreted it as a sign of the prophet's great spiritual effort. "Why did you not come to me when I sent the first time?" Balak demanded, skipping greetings and diplomacy. "Am I not able to promote you to great honor?" Balaam stood before the king of Moab, surrounded by the power and wealth of the nation, yet he no longer cared for their promises. He was only focused on the word of the angel. "Indeed, I have come to you now," Balaam replied, his voice low and serious. "But understand this, your majesty. I have no power to say anything by myself. The word that God puts in my mouth that only I must speak." Balak heard the words, but he dismissed the warning. He was too consumed by his fear of Israel and his faith in ritual to notice the fear in the prophet's eyes. He believed Balaam was simply establishing the seriousness of his power, not revealing a dire constraint. "Very well," Balak said, waving the caution aside. "Then let us begin." The king led Balaam to a fortified city where he performed a ritual of welcome, sacrificing oxen and sheep. The next morning, Balak took the prophet to a high place called Bamoth Baal, the high places of Baal. From this vantage point, they could see the vast, sprawling camp of Israel below. Balak was prepared. He had 7 altars built. He planned to bombard heaven with offerings, believing that sheer volume of ritual could purchase the change of heart he desperately needed. He turned to Balaam, his face tight with expectation. Now, the king commanded, "Curse them for me." The stage was set. The desperate king awaited a word of doom. The humbled prophet knew he carried only a word of blessing. The spiritual confrontation was about to begin, not on the dusty road, but on the sacrificial mountains of Moab. The summit of Bamoth Baal, the high places dedicated to the Moabite god, was windswept and barren. Balak, still pulsating with impatience and dread, led the shaken Balaam to the peak. From here, the panorama was immense. Stretching far across the plain, shimmering faintly in the heat of the morning, were the countless white tents of the Israelite camp. To the eye of King Balak, it was a terrifying sight, a multitude too great to be conquered by steel. To the eye of Balaam, who now saw the spiritual realm with a clarity he could not ignore, it was a picture of God's promise fulfilled. Balak had wasted no time. 7 altars had been hastily constructed on the summit, lined up in anticipation of a potent magical ritual. The sacrifices were prepared. Balak believed that if he offered enough, If he displayed enough fervor, he could purchase the reversal of a divine decree. The animals were brought forward and the ceremony began. The smoke from the offerings rose thick into the sky, a desperate appeal from the fearful king. "Stand by your offering," Balak commanded the prophet, his eyes alight with expectation. "I will go to seek the omens." Balaam, however, did not need to seek omens. He had already encountered the angel of the Lord. He knew his mission was no longer to curse, but to serve as a passive vessel for the word of the Almighty. He withdrew a short distance, not to conjure or consult spirits, but to wait for the command of the one true God. The word came to him clear and unyielding. When Balaam returned, Balak was waiting eagerly. His face was tense. He had spent a fortune to bring this man here. He had risked his kingdom's stability. He expected a word of doom. Instead, Balaam opened his mouth and spoke the first oracle, his voice ringing with a conviction that was not his own. "From Aram Balak has brought me," Balaam proclaimed, looking out over the valley where the tents lay. "The king of Moab said, 'Come curse Jacob for me and come denounce Israel.'" The king leaned forward, anticipation turning to confusion. "But how shall I curse whom God has not cursed?" Balaam continued the words, striking the king like a hammer blow. "How shall I denounce whom the Lord has not denounced from the top of the rocks? I see them from the hills, I behold them, a people dwelling apart, not counted among the nations." The message was unmistakable. Israel was set aside by God himself. They were a people untouchable by human scheme or Moabite fear. The blessing was already in place. Balak's jaw dropped. His hands clenched at his sides. The expectation drained from his face, replaced by fury and the bitter taste of betrayal. "What have you done to me?" he cried out, his voice raw with disbelief. "I brought you to curse my enemies, and instead you have blessed them completely." Balaam, sobered by the recent encounter with the angel, could only answer with an air of fatalism. "Must I not take heed to speak what the Lord puts in my mouth?" The lesson was clear. God's blessing is unbreakable. No curse can overturn it. But Balak, blinded by his fear and his ingrained belief in the power of ritual, was not ready to accept defeat. He believed the positioning was wrong. He believed there must be a way to manipulate the divine. "Come," the king insisted, his face hardened by stubbornness. "We will try another location." Balak was enraged, yet his refusal to accept the truth propelled him forward. He led Balaam away from Bamoth Baal to a second separate location, the field of Zophim located on the top of Pisgah. Perhaps, the king reasoned, his voice desperate and hoarse, if you see only a portion of them, a smaller fringe of the camp, you will be able to speak the curse. He still clung to the notion that the sheer sight of the multitudes was somehow inhibiting the prophet's power. Once more, 7 altars were diligently built. Once more, the elaborate ritual of the sacrifices was performed. The smoke of the offerings rose a second time, a monument to the king's futile persistence. Balak stood by the offerings, his heart filled with a mixture of dread and fierce, stubborn hope. Balaam withdrew to receive the word of the Lord. He returned, and the solemnity in his eyes had deepened. He looked directly at Balak, and the second oracle he delivered was not merely a blessing. It was a profound theological statement on the nature of the divine. "Rise up, Balak, and here listen to me, son of Zippor," Balaam commanded. Then came the unshakable pronouncement, the core truth that destroyed all of Balak's magical thinking. "God is not man that he should lie, nor a son of man that he should change his mind. As he said, the meaning was absolute. The blessing on Israel was not a fragile decree that could be altered by a change of scenery or an increase in offerings. It was rooted in the unchangeable, eternal character of God himself. Balaam continued detailing the invincibility of Israel. "Behold, I have received a command to bless. He stated that no spell, no sorcery, and no scheme of men or demons could prevail against them. The king's stubbornness finally collapsed into a desperate plea. He knew the curse was impossible. He knew the gold was wasted. "If you will not curse them at all," Balak pleaded, wringing his hands in defeat, "at least do not bless them." Balaam looked at the miserable king, whose fear had driven him to such futile expenditure. He answered simply, "Did I not tell you all that the Lord speaks that I must do?" The second attempt had failed more spectacularly than the first. Balak's hope was nearly extinguished. He had tried to buy a curse and had received only a foundational truth about God's irreversible faithfulness. Yet in his final blind rage, he refused to stop. "Come on," growled, pointing to a third mountain in the distance. "Perhaps the Lord will be pleased for you to curse them for me from there." He would try one more time. He would not realize that with each ritual, God was merely using him to declare the coming glory of Israel ever more clearly. Balak's desperation had reached a point of pathetic futility. He clung to the final, irrational hope that the location, the perspective, must be the key. He led Balaam to the third mountain, the summit of Peor, which looked out over the barren wasteland stretching toward the horizon. "This must be the one," Balak muttered, wiping the sweat from his brow. "Here the omens must favor us." For the third time, Balak ordered the building of 7 altars, and for the third time the offerings were prepared. The smoke rose into the sky, a ritual of pure, exhausting repetition. The king of Moab was trying to wear out heaven with sheer persistence. This time, however, Balaam did not withdraw to seek omens or consult the divine. He knew the futility of such a gesture. He had seen the angel. He knew the word was immutable. Instead, Balaam simply set his face toward the wilderness, where Israel's tents lay. And then something powerful and awe-inspiring occurred. The Spirit of God came upon him. It was not a gentle whisper or a careful communication. It was a rush of irresistible divine fire that seized his very being. The prophet's own desires, his greed, and his ambitions were momentarily purged, replaced by the blazing certainty of God's sovereign will. Balaam fell down, not in terror as before, but in awe, yet with his eyes wide open, seeing visions of the Almighty. He was no longer speaking for himself, or even for the gold of Moab. He was speaking for eternity. He rose to his feet, facing the sprawling camps of Israel. The voice that emerged from him was rich with divine authority, silencing the hills and the frantic, fearful king beside him. "The oracle of Balaam, son of Beor," he proclaimed. "The oracle of the man whose eyes are opened. The oracle of one who hears the words of God, who knows the knowledge of the Most High." The blessing was about to be spoken, and no power on earth or in the treasury of Moab could halt its delivery. The third oracle poured from Balaam's lips, painting a glorious future for the people he was hired to destroy. He did not see a threatening, consuming swarm of people as Balak did. He saw a landscape of divine beauty. "Your dwellings, O Israel," he described their destiny with lyrical, idyllic imagery, like valleys that stretch out like gardens beside a river, like aloes planted by the Lord, like cedars beside the waters. Israel's future was abundance, deep strength, and majestic flourishing. Their prosperity was guaranteed, their destiny secured. Furthermore, he prophesied the rise of an indigenous king whose fame and power would transcend the rulers of the nations. He described the people not as a vulnerable tribe, but as a mighty lion, untouchable by external forces. "He crouches, he lies down like a lion," Balaam declared. "Who dares to rouse him?" he concluded, by reiterating the foundational promise given to Abraham: "Blessed are those who bless you, and cursed are those who curse you." This was the final devastating pronouncement that turned the king's scheme completely against him. Balak could bear it no longer. His plan, his wealth, and his hope had been systematically demolished over 3 mountains. He struck his hands together in a gesture of pure, desperate fury. "I called you to curse my enemies," Balak screamed, his voice breaking with rage and humiliation. and 3 times you have done nothing but bless them. Flee to your place. I would have honored you greatly, but the Lord has denied you honor." The king was broken. In his final outburst, he acknowledged the undeniable truth. It was the Lord, not Balaam, who had denied the reward. The prophet, humbled and vindicated, stood firm. "Did I not tell your messengers?" Balaam countered, "I cannot go beyond the word of the Lord. What he speaks that I must speak." The conflict was over. The king had failed to purchase the curse. But Balaam, still moved by the spirit that had seized him, was not yet finished. One last breathtaking vision remained, a prophecy that stretched far beyond the fate of Moab. Balak was consumed by his own fury and loss, yet Balaam, standing tall on the peak of Peor, delivered one final unsolicited oracle. This was the most profound vision of all, a word that would echo through history for centuries. The prophet turned his gaze away from the immediate Israelite camp and toward a distant, unseen future. His words carried the weight of destiny. "I see him, but not now," Balaam proclaimed. "I behold him, but not near." Then he delivered the core of the prophecy. "A star shall come out of Jacob, and a scepter shall rise out of Israel." The star and the scepter were twin symbols of a coming king, a ruler who would arise not for a temporary reign, but for an everlasting dominion. He would be the ultimate fulfillment of God's blessing. This final king would bring about the irreversible end of Israel's enemies. The scepter of Israel shall defeat the leaders of Moab and bring down all the sons of Sheth. The very land where Balak stood, the very king who sought the curse, was named as the target of this coming ruler's triumph. This oracle was a powerful foreshadowing of the Messiah, the Christ. The story notes that centuries later, this star prophecy would guide the wise men from the east to Bethlehem, seeking the infant king. The prophet, once tempted by the riches of Moab, had spoken of a kingdom that could not be bought, a dominion unshaken by gold or power. Balak was defeated. His immense wealth, his elaborate rituals, and his desperate persistence had achieved the opposite of his intention. Instead of erasing Israel, he had sponsored a prophecy that declared his own nation's downfall and the eternal glory of the king who would rise from Israel. The word was spoken. The future was sealed. Balak, silent and defeated, dismissed Balaam. There was no reward given, no honor bestowed. The chests of gold that had been carried all the way from Moab were hauled back, their contents untouched, but their purpose utterly ruined. Balaam, the prophet of 2 worlds, rode away from the palace of the king. He was a man who had been stripped of his arrogance by an angel and saved from a fatal blow by a faithful donkey. He had delivered truth greater than his own flawed character, words that reached into eternity. The story of Balaam, the talking donkey, and the angry king remains a profound testament to the sovereignty of God. Balak sought to buy a curse and received only irreversible blessing. He tried to silence the promise, and instead heard the prophecy of the star and the scepter that would rule the nations. Balaam stands as a timeless mirror. He heard the voice of God clearly, yet his heart still longed for the gold and honor of men. His obedience was forced, a sharp reminder of how dangerous a divided heart can be. To truly obey God means surrendering every hidden desire to his authority. The donkey, the lowest and most humble creature, saw what the prophet missed. The voice least expected became God's instrument of correction, proving that authority comes from the word given by the Lord, not the title held by man. The kingdoms of men rise and fall. The curse failed. The blessing endures forever. The star still shines, pointing directly to the true king whose dominion will never end. Balaam rode back to his home, no longer the confident seer, but a man who understood that no one can overturn what God has blessed. The story of Balaam, King Balak, and the talking donkey is an unparalleled study in spiritual irony and human frailty. My personal feeling toward Balaam is one of profound disappointment. He stands as a tragic figure who possessed genuine prophetic power, but allowed his gift to be corrupted by the whisper of gold and the lure of influence. He was tested not on his ability to hear God's voice, but on his willingness to obey it fully, and he failed the crucial test of the divided heart. He embodies the timeless warning that seeking personal gain while attempting to serve the divine will ultimately blind a person to the clearest signs of heavenly intervention. King Balak, meanwhile, represents the futility of human fear and manipulation, wasting a fortune in a desperate attempt to overturn an irreversible divine blessing with political schemes and repetitive ritual. The most affecting element of the narrative is the silent hero, the donkey. She is the physical manifestation of humility and immediate spiritual clarity, seeing the drawn sword of the angel of the Lord when the renowned seer was utterly blind. The donkey's repeated refusal to move forward was not disobedience, but a persistent act of grace, absorbing her master's wrath to save his existence. This gives rise to a vital lesson. We must learn to listen not only to the monumental voices of authority, but also to the small, unexpected sources of friction in our lives. The inconvenient obstacle, the sudden delay, or the surprising warning delivered by the most unlikely messenger may be God's protection, intervening directly to guide us away from a perilous path. Therefore, my ultimate advice to the listener is to embrace complete surrender and trust the promise. The 4 oracles delivered by Balaam stand as an unbreakable decree that what God has declared blessed, whether a nation, a purpose, or a person, cannot be cursed by any human power, no matter how much wealth is offered or how many mountains are climbed. The fear that drove Balak and the ambition that drove Balaam were both futile. We should strive for a heart that, like the faithful donkey, prioritizes immediate safety and loyalty over self-interest, allowing us to see the divine presence and rest securely in the absolute certainty of God's enduring word. If you enjoyed this story, please support the channel by clicking the like button and subscribing for more biblical journeys. I would love to read your thoughts and reflections in the comments section below. Remember that no shadow is deep enough to hide you from the light. Thank you for watching, and see you in the next video.